Today I'm going to talk about learning Chinese back in 1968, what I went through then, and what I would do differently today. And from that, you will see the extent to which language learning has improved and has become easier for a number of reasons. So in 1968, I was sent to Hong Kong by the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, my employer. My job was to learn Mandarin Chinese, and that's what I did full time. So I don't remember everything. I know we had at least 2-on-1 instruction because I know that when I was sitting in a classroom with a fellow Canadian diplomat and I was told that in Chinese to say, "Are you going?" they say, "You go not go," "Ni chu bu chu." His reaction was, "Is that ever stupid?" He was not a very successful language learner. You can't treat things in a new language that are different as being stupid. You have to get used to them. At any rate, my next recollection is that I was struggling with a book called Chinese Dialogues, for which there was also audio. Audio spoken, what seemed to me, very, very quickly. Now, in doing some research, it turns out that Chinese Dialogues, which was written entirely in a romanized version, like what we call pinyin today, but which then was the Yale romanization script, and that the audio was produced 8 years after the book was first published. So they published books without audio. And so my initial, I think it was a month or so, was listening to this rapid fire, or what seemed rapid fire Chinese, struggling to get used to the sounds of the language. After that, we were introduced to characters. We were introduced to characters using flashcards. And I did a lot of writing, repetitively writing these flashcards. And I have described in the past how I had a self sort of designed spaced repetition system to learn the characters. And then we got onto books that were actually interesting. Again, I don't remember the order, but one of the books was 20 Lectures on Chinese Culture. Again, there was no audio for this book. Teachers were supposed to create their own audio. So it's very interesting that what we take for granted today, MP3 players carrying it all in your telephone, was not the case. We had open reel tape recorders, and you had to almost get access to a language lab in order to listen to the language, and there was far less audio, far fewer examples of things available to listen to. But that was the sort of trajectory. And from there I went to a book that I have referred to before called Intermediate Mandarin Pattern Approach, or something of that nature, which was an excellent book. And thereafter I went into all of the Yale and China readers in literature, readers in communist Chinese literature, and so forth and so on. And basically, whatever I could find. I would go to the bookstores, I would search for any material I could find that had text with, a glossary after every chapter. And I would just practice writing the new words that I came across, but I had limited opportunity to listen. I've been digging through just a tiny part of the material that I bought, and I bought far more than I used as part of my Chinese learning journey. So obviously these flashcards were a key part of learning how to write. I've explained that. I bought all kinds of dictionaries that I hardly ever used, but of course I was a Canadian government employee, so they paid for the dictionaries. This was a textbook entitled Selected Readings in Chinese Communist Literature. Interestingly, it was all in traditional characters, and I just underlined all these vocabulary items, tried to write them out to some extent in my horrible Chinese characters. And there was just so much of this stuff, like one of my favorite books, Intermediate Reader in Modern Chinese. Here again, you see the same pattern, underlining vocabulary items, trying to write out the characters. Invariably, there were all kinds of grammatical explanations, which I totally ignored because I couldn't understand what they meant. Mostly, it was a matter of getting a hold of certain key sort of conjunction, fire, 一致语, 不当反而. So those were the patterns. I didn't ever figure out what S1, VP1, S2, etc. all meant. But I just exposed myself to enough of these patterns, stuck with, seizing some of these key conjunctions, connecting words, and gradually through my massive input and reading, the language became more and more familiar and less strange. Characters is one difficulty with Mandarin Chinese, the tones is another. And I remember that a major breakthrough for me was when my teacher gave me a cassette tape of xiangsheng, which are these comic dialogues, which I listened to over and over and over again, even though I couldn't understand more than 30 or 40% of it. And I certainly didn't understand the various historical and literary references. This is Ho Bao-lin, a very famous xiangsheng performer, but it gave me the rhythm. And with the rhythm, I was able to get a sense of the tones, because trying to read and trying to remember the tone marks for each individual word or character was simply too difficult. So I've sort of summarized that very quickly. I have described my earlier experience in learning Mandarin before, but I want to now get into what I would do today. Today, I am today. We are never the same. We never step in the same river twice, as Heraclitus said. So I'm different. I have a favorite place to learn languages, and it's linked. So that's where I would go. And I would not only see a tremendous array of potential, learning content to choose from, and the ability to bring in content from elsewhere, but I would also find various types of functionality that would make learning Mandarin much easier today than it was back in 1968. I would start with the mini stories. I would do the mini stories in sentence mode. I can ask our AI at Link or elsewhere, what are the most difficult patterns for learners of Mandarin? And we would get a short list of the most difficult structures in the language. I can ask our AI at Link for a list of conjunctions, and that then becomes a lesson. So I can actually make my grammar questions and the answers to my grammar questions into a lesson and deal with some of the grammar that way, as opposed to the very complicated diagrams and special abbreviations that were used by my teachers in explaining grammar in Chinese, all of which explanations I ignored, and I just exposed myself to more and more of the language and underlined and circled and those kinds of things. So certainly today I would look for podcasts on subjects of interest to me. I would probably, if I'm not confident that I know what to ask, say in YouTube or Google, I would translate it at Google Translate and search for podcasts on Chinese history, or maybe an audio recording of something from Chinese literature, or maybe geography of China, or whatever I'm interested in. I would search for audio and text in that material, which I can then import into Link. With my experience with xiangsheng, and by the way, over and above what I was shown by my teacher back in 1968, subsequently I have maintained my connection to Mandarin, and particularly, some 20, 30 years ago, by, when I was in China, buying CDs of xiangsheng, CDs of the famous classics of Chinese literature, CDs on Chinese history, and I would just massively listen to these. Now I think if I could find text that corresponded to that audio, I would probably try to import that into Link, or I would simply import the audio and let Link create the transcript, which may not be 100% accurate, and I would then continue to use Link in conjunction with a lot of listening away from the computer. The big thing that has changed compared to when I studied Mandarin is obviously the access to digital text, the ability to look things up, the ability to ask AI for grammatical explanations when I want them on questions that are of interest to me, the portability of audio, the ability to be anywhere listening to whatever I want, and then to come back and read that same material, looking up words and saving the words with all the additional functionality. One app that I would certainly buy if I were learning Mandarin today is Scritter. We can export our saved links at Link into Scritter, and there you can practice, with your hand on your iPhone or your Android, tracing the characters, the stroke order, and there's a number of functions at Scritter that are tremendous in terms of, reviewing your characters and getting to know them better. It's worth exploring. So that's certainly one of the apps that I would use, which would make learning characters a lot easier than it was back in 1958. Just as I bought more dictionaries than I needed, I would probably buy more apps than I need in order to explore different ways of learning Mandarin, because the one thing that hasn't changed from when I was learning in 1968 in Hong Kong And what I would do today is that I have to find my own resources. And I definitely would recommend that to anyone, regardless of the language. Find content of interest, find apps that work for you, explore the language, take the initiative not only to, learn the language and spend the time with the language, which you have to do, but also to find all the resources that can help you learn the language. Basically, so that's what I did back in 1968, which is almost 60 years ago, and what I would do today. This video was triggered by a comment from one of my listeners commenting on my video about learning slow. He or she said, that's not what you did for Mandarin Chinese. So I want to point out that when I learned Mandarin Chinese, I was paid for by the government, but I didn't spend my time worrying about how quickly I would learn. I spent my time making sure that I was active, that I was finding resources and content of interest to me. In other words, I took the initiative, but I was mostly focused on immersing myself in the language as much as possible, but not expecting to learn it in any sort of record time. And the more you immerse yourself, the more active you are, the more you take the initiative, the faster you will learn, without having necessarily the goal of learning as fast as possible, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it might be. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.